Hi, I'm Janice Switlo. In my last episode, I spoke about Bill C-92, that is the Child Welfare Act. And I set out, what's going on with that. Today, I want to talk about, and I want to point out first, Canada did not need to do it that way. It's a classic strategy. They appear to be giving, but what they're actually doing is taking far more, and in this situation, taking your children, just like they did before with residential schools. It's no different. It's a colonial strategy in order to achieve your termination, your capitulation, your giving up, and only this time the giving up is done through giving up your children and actually taking them, because you're being manipulated to believe that you're exercising your own jurisdiction. And instead, what you're doing is giving it away or agreeing that Canada took it. Anyway, what I want to talk to you today is, okay, what do you do about this? Okay, what you don't do, okay? You don't go holding up band council offices. You don't go putting yourself in harm's way by triggering application of Canada's Anti-Terrorism Act. Things are really itchy right now with what's happened in the Middle East. There's a lot of talk about aggression and war, and you don't need to trigger anyone who's already dealing with that attitude and information and giving them any reason to take you out of the picture. So you need to be cognizant of that. What I'm talking about gets me emotional, not my children. So I can only imagine when it's your brothers and sisters and you're the mums and dads. Yeah, you're going to be angry about this, but I ask you to take a breath. Remember your core laws, because remember, to be effective and to counter this, you need to act using your Indigenous laws and not attracting or giving any reason, excuse to Canada in order to apply its laws by suggesting that safety's at risk, for example, or there's some threat to national security. The threat, let's be clear, and you need to maintain this, the threat is to you. The threat is to your children. The threat is to your sovereignty. The threat is to your nationhood. Everything that is never supposed to happen. Why? Because you have a relationship with the Crown. Canada is bound by that. Canada, thus, is not only threatening the peace and threatening war with you, but also with the Crown. Because that is not acting by passing laws saying, Crown, you must be bound by this. Because, and they paint this picture that this is what you've asked for as Indigenous nationals, you want to go under. So what kinds of steps do you need to take? Well, you need to really paper trail. And you need to confirm and confine the powers of chief and council to being only for purposes of the Indian Act. That's what that body's about. So you need to confirm that any election code, membership code, anything like that, those laws are only in place for purposes of the Indian Act. You're electing chief and council for purposes of the Indian Act. You are not handing over your bundle of rights as Indigenous nationals as part of your larger nation. This is a confined exercise. You need to confirm, in confirming, verbalize, you do it in writing. You need to have a paper trail of this that you can preserve so your next generations can rely upon. You need to confirm you have not handed over your responsibilities under Indigenous law. You need to confirm you have not abandoned, you have not capitulated or given up. You do not accept Section 35 doctrine. You will not insult your nation. You will not insult your ancestors. You've always been human, and you cannot be manipulated into being seen to having agree that Canada has a lawful right to push you aside as if you and your ancestors and your children remain beasts of the field. You confirm this is not a question of consultation and accommodation. If it is a matter, it is always, from whatever is in play, it is always a matter of seeking permissions from you. So, for example, well, you may be approached and said, it's a consultation exercise. You may be approached and say, we want to talk to you about this, and we want to find out things from this. You need to recharacterize that process under your laws, because that may be what Canada says under Canadian law it needs to do. You don't have to agree that works. You don't have to agree that Section 35 is going to dominate your relationship. They can't make you accept that. The counter to that needs to be, okay. And first thing I always recommend, listen. Do not speak. Do not answer the questions. Listen. And then after it's concluded, you do a carefully written concluding letter saying, you asked to speak to us. We listened. We understand that you're seeking permission from us for whatever it might be, an economic opportunity, who knows. And you need to confirm and explain that, well, yes, under treaties, only the Crown can take up land in certain circumstances and her subjects, not companies. We've had a previous talk about that. But here's what's important. Where she has not taken up the land, that's still your land with full ability to use. You still have economic sovereignty. You can still use that economic sovereignty and discuss those resources and those lands with other nations, with other foreign nations. If Her Majesty wants to be part of that, then it may make sense to have a tripartite discussion on that. But it is not, let's be clear, the exercise is not a Section 35 consultation and accommodation. The exercise is the Crown's governments want permissions from you for something. So first step, they need to approach you to tell you what it is they're talking about, what they need permissions for. You then take it under advisement. You don't respond, you don't answer to their questions. You control the discussion. You control the meetings. You say, under our nation-to-nation relationship, we've been approached with this request for permissions, and here's our terms. And what I recommend is that, well, before we get to that, we need to have some sign of good faith. There may be some outstanding issues, that haven't been addressed. Get those caught up, then we'll talk. Those kinds of things. The fact that you don't opt into these Canadian initiatives does not mean that you do not have the ability to engage in the economy. Quite the contrary. Your hands become tied when you opt into this. On your own nation, rights, actual rights, economic sovereignty. You have the ability to decide. And they will need to, Canada, other countries, they will need to satisfy you. This is not fairy tale stuff. This is not something that's not practical, that's not going to happen. You haven't even begun to use what your ancestors left for you. Haven't even begun. Because first you need to understand what that is and what it is not. And you need to also say, and I'm not, preaching, but people have asked why I'm doing this session. People have asked, well, what do we do? Okay, so I'm directly this kind, especially Bill C-92. And other things that your chiefs may be signing into, First Nations Land Management Act, things like that. And I'm going to have another session very soon on what you do about that. I've had chiefs approach me saying the previous chief signed into this thing. We haven't passed the code, but we don't like being on the schedule. So I'm gonna in the next episode talk about what you do to counter that, because Canada says, once you're on that schedule, we can't remove you. We don't know how. Well, you you make them remove you. You don't ask, and there's things you need to do in order to achieve that. So anyhow, getting back to C-92. Remember, keep your hands off my children. Do not hold my children hostage. The fact remains you have failed to meet any kind of standard. You have put these conditions in place designed This is part of the definition of genocide. You've designed this to happen. The outcomes were not only predictable, but planned. Our lack of actual independent advisors to warn us, as I am doing, don't exist, because they've all been educated to accept they're only Canadians. Well, the ancestors left for you the reminders through someone like myself to tell you and remind you, because they can't personally be here right now, that you are still a nation. You're still nationals of a nation. You have this ability and power. You do not have to accept that whether they're starving you, whether they're taking your children, you do not have to accept that. Now let's get to the worst case scenario in terms of what can be possible using Bill C-92. You can have, everyone knows how in some communities the chiefs can control the people. Well, now imagine the power handed to the chief to control what happens to your children. Is anyone going to question any conversion of collective assets into that chief's personal pocketbook when that chief has the ability under this bill to put in place an Aboriginal, an Indigenous governing body that can exercise its own discretion and the judges will support to take your children? Imagine the political tool that this represents. Imagine what can be done to harm families. Those families who say and know who they are. Those families who carry the entire country on their shoulders. To allow this as a possibility, never mind a probability given on how this is written, is just truly evil. But you don't react in an evil manner. You remember you to be effective. You need to respect your own laws. You need to act in accordance with the relationship that exists. You, yes, will be angry. Yes, will be upset. But you need to counter this not by reacting and giving Canada every excuse and reason. You need to turn that around. Who's the bad person here? Whoever concocted this bloody law, and I call it bloody because it's a death sentence to the nations. That's all I have to say.